Well, good morning. I want to welcome you as well to our service this morning. Special welcome to those of you who are visiting and joining us online. And I too want to take a moment. The message is not Mother's Day related, but take a moment to say Happy Mother's Day as well, and to recognize the role and the importance, as Rod has already stated, of mothers. As I think for myself, I'm very blessed in this way with a mother, a godly mother who, in large part, is a reason why I stand before you in this position. Also in our own home, Becca is a great mother to our children, and she probably doesn't get thanks enough. And even my mother-in-law is pretty great. I'm not sure if I just earned brownie points or just got knocked down from my status of favorite son-in-law right there, but all around grandmothers. And so I've been blessed in this way. And at least in our home, when you want something fixed, you go to Dad. But when you're hurt and you need to cry and you need to feel some things and feel loved, you go to Mom. And so mothers just have a special place. But I also am sensitive to the fact that there's some, as I stand and look around this room, that would just long to even have your mom here to tell her one more time how much you love her and appreciate her. And there's some of you who the desire of your heart to be a mother has gone unfulfilled yet at this point, and a range of emotions in between. And so I want to be sensitive to that as well. But wish you all and say thank you to those of you who are mothers in the role, those that you call mom, and the role that you play in the lives of people that you've touched. We are in Joshua chapter 4 at this point, and just to do a little bit of recap to bring us up to where we're at. We've been journeying through Joshua, and some of the reason we're in Joshua is because of this generation to generation theme that has kind of been in the back or front of our minds throughout this year. And within the book of Joshua, there are a number of times where the people of Israel are commanded to remember or to tell the next generation of what God has been doing, what He's done in the past. And so we want to take and highlight some of those things and remind ourselves, command ourselves to do the same, to be passing along from generation to generation the wonders, the majesty, the fear of the Lord, as we'll read this morning. But in Joshua chapter 1, as we look, there's this phrase, be strong and courageous, and Joshua is commanded to be strong and courageous a number of times within chapter 1. And we looked at the word courage. And courage is not this absence of fear. In fact, in order for courage to exist, fear must be present, because courage is this ability that to act in spite of fear. And there were two sources of courage that we looked at. One was that there are external factors, that courage is not something that we necessarily muster up within us. It's not necessarily something that we're born with or not, but that we get courage from things external to us. And so in this case, the courage that Joshua is commanded to have is because of God. Because of what God has done, Joshua can continue in courage and move in that way. Also, courage comes to us by way of a greater fear, a deeper fear. That is, for instance, if I'm afraid of heights and I need to climb a ladder and there's other people around, I might be more afraid of the embarrassment of not getting myself up that ladder than I am of heights. And so I'm motivated by the fear of something greater. And in this context, the fear of something greater would be the fear of God. So not obeying His commands, and the fear of God is greater than whatever it is He's telling me to do. And so I'm emboldened, I'm encouraged to move in that way. So that's the command, because there's going to be moments along this journey now as the Israelites move into the promised land where strength and courage are needed. And so we begin to look at these things. In Joshua chapter 2, Pastor Bob, in looking at this spy mission and Rahab's involvement, here's the phrase that I would bring back to us from that message, and it's this idea that God's kingdom mission gets accomplished. In the overall view of God's kingdom mission, none of our experiences in life are wasted. God uses each of them to accomplish His kingdom mission in us and through us. And so God wastes nothing. There's those moments in our lives that seem meaningless or lacking in meaning, or it just are difficult and hard, and we wonder why. They're accomplishing something. God is doing something. And so the question for us then is, what kingdom mission is God accomplishing through our present experiences? And then moving into chapter 3 last week, and Pastor Randy sort of coming into that same vein as the Israelites are approaching the Jordan River at flood stage, and he talked about how large that would be, potentially, I think, from here to Allensville. And the idea for us then in this kind of same idea is, what flooded, impassable river are you staring at? And are we waiting on God to lead us or to lead you? This phrase from chapter 3 is this idea of following the Ark of the Covenant. When the Ark moves, we move, because we've never been this way before. And that's how you'll know which way to go. And so essentially, I would summarize it this way: when God moves, you move and you follow Him. And that's how you'll know where to go. And so that truth applies to us today. So that brings us up to Joshua chapter 4. So we're going to take this kind of in three parts, and then I have sort of three questions or statements that we're going to ask ourselves here this morning. So Joshua chapter 4, if you want to follow along in your Bibles, we're going to read the whole of chapter 4, and then we're going to pause, and we'll go into chapter 5. Joshua chapter 4 and verse 1. When the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priests are standing, and carry them over with you, and put them down at the place where you stay tonight. So Joshua called together the 12 men he had appointed from the Israelites, one from each tribe, and said to them, Go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, What do these stones mean? Tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, when it crossed the Jordan. The waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. So the Israelites did as Joshua commanded them. They took 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, as the Lord had told Joshua, and they carried them over with them to their camp, where they put them down. Joshua set up the 12 stones that had been in the middle of the Jordan at the spot where the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant had stood, and they are there to this day. Now the priests who carried the ark remained standing in the middle of the Jordan until everything the Lord had commanded Joshua was done by the people, just as Moses had directed Joshua. The people hurried over, and as soon as all of them had crossed the ark of the Lord, and the priests came to the other side while the people watched, the men of Reuben and Gad and the half tribe of Manasseh crossed over, ready for battle in front of the Israelites, as Moses had directed them. About 40,000 armed for battle crossed over before the Lord to the plains of Jericho for war. That day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they stood in awe of him all the days of his life, just as they had stood in awe of Moses. And then the Lord said to Joshua, Command the priests carrying the ark of the covenant law to come up out of the Jordan. And so Joshua commanded the priests, Come up out of the Jordan. And the priests came up out of the river carrying the ark of the covenant of the Lord. And no sooner had they set their feet on the dry ground than the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and ran at flood stage as before. On the 10th day of the first month, the people went up from the Jordan and camped at Gilgal on the eastern border of Jericho. And Joshua set up Gilgal, the 12 stones they had taken out of the Jordan. He said to the Israelites, in the future, when your descendants ask their parents, what do these stones mean? Tell them, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan what he had done to the Red Sea. And when he dried it up before us until we had crossed over, he did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God. That last part of chapter 4 is really kind of the focus, at least in my mind, of all of this journey through Joshua, and this idea of when your children see these stones, when these moments happen, and they ask why, what they mean, you'll be able to tell them this. And so the first kind of point that I want to make here this morning is this idea of remembering. Why is it important for us to remember? In my mind, there's a number of reasons, but the main one has to do with how we respond when God fulfills His promises. How do we respond when God fulfills His promises? I think there's a tendency. Let me start this way. One way we respond, or one thing that happens when God fulfills His promises, is that our faith is bolstered. Our faith is bolstered. That is to say that the next time you get to the Jordan River, per se, because God parted it before, our faith is increased in a way that causes us to believe that He can part it again, or He will part it again. And so remembering strengthens our faith. It bolsters our faith for the next event, because there are going to be more in our lives. We move from kind of Jordan River to Jordan River type of moments. And as God fulfills His promises, our faith is bolstered as we remember and we recall. But we're human. And so somehow we forget from one river to the next. And we still end up arriving at that next river freaking out because how are we going to get across? And in that moment, here's the command: remember. Remember what God did the last time, and He fulfilled His promise. So remembering helps us in those moments where we show up at a difficult situation, or in a period of time where we can't do it on our own, and we're called to remember the times that God has shown up for us in the past. It bolsters our faith to move forward in confidence into whatever river you find yourself facing now. The second thing I think remembering does is it keeps us in right perspective. And maybe this isn't true for you, but it's definitely true for me, that I think our human nature inclines us to take credit for things that we have no business taking credit for. Here's what I mean by that. That this whole company of Israel has just crossed over the Jordan River. God has done a miraculous thing, and He's been doing miraculous things for them all this time. Somehow in our mind, we get to these places where especially when things are going well, we forget that we still need God. And we kind of begin to think that we're doing all right on our own. Almost in the sense that we forget that it was Him that got us across the Jordan River. And so remembering keeps at least me in right perspective, right line of thinking. That is to say that I didn't get myself across the Jordan River. God did that. And that my head does not become too large. That I don't begin to think of myself in ways that I shouldn't. And so remembering rightly, I think, keeps us, in a sense, humble, and keeps us remembering the bigness of God and our smallness in comparison. Who's doing what here? And so I think in addition to bolstering our faith, it keeps us in right perspective. But it's important that we are careful about what it is we are remembering, because our memories can be to our detriment. And the Israelite people Joshua commands them to pick up these 12 stones to represent each tribe, and he builds this monument that will be this reminder of what God has done. And so when you look at that, you're to remember the power and the hand of God. When your children, verses 21 through 24, when your children ask their fathers in times to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall let your children know Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground, for the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up for us until we passed over, so that all the peoples of the earth, and here's the key part. This is what we're remembering. Certainly the event, but the event is there for us to remember this about who God is. So that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, and that you may fear the Lord your God forever. So when we look at the stones, yes, we remember that Jordan River event, but beneath that event, what we're ultimately called to remember is not just the parting of the water, but the mighty hand of God. And that moves us to this position of fearing the Lord. Okay, and I link this back to this idea of fear, this fear of something greater that gives us courage to do things that we're afraid of. So the fear of the Lord being a greater motivator than the fear of man. That is, when we face obstacles in front of us, that we fear God. The fear of the Lord is greater within us than the fear of what lies ahead of us in this physical world. That's what we're called to remember. Unfortunately, what we sometimes do, and maybe what we need to take inventory of, is, and this would be, I guess, the first question or comment that I would make is this: what are my stones of remembrance? What are my stones of remembrance? What are those moments in my life that bring me back to this place of recognizing the hand of the Almighty God and the fear of the Lord? Welling up in me this fear of the Lord. There might, for some of us, be stones of remembrance that we actually just need to tear down. Because when difficult times come, where do you go? Where does your mind go? Does it go to the stones that bring us to this place, or does it go to the stones that bring us to places of pain and hurt and trauma? Because we set up monuments there as well. And we need to be careful what pile of stones we're going to. Because the ones that bring up the pain and the trauma and the hurt, that's not going to help us. These are the stones that we're called to remember. And as I think about my own life, I went to a number of places. I was just kind of began at the beginning and was sort of journeying through, and this was not an exhaustive list, but I had to think of, I would put a stone at Camp Kanesatake, where I first chose to receive Christ into my life. There would be a stone at Ben and Darlene's River Lot, where I was baptized. There would be stones in Belarus when I was 16 and went on the missions trip from this church to Belarus. There would be stones at Southeastern University in Lakeland, Florida, during what I'd call renewal services. There would be stones really scattered throughout this valley, but there would be stones at 388 and 449 Hickory Lane. There's places everywhere that bring me to a place of recognizing that the hand of the Lord is mighty in my life, and then hopefully moving me to this position of fearing the Lord my God forever. And so that's what we're called to remember. And so the question that I would place before you is, what are the stones, what are your stones, my stones of remembrance? If we continue on then, beginning now in chapter 5. The Israelites have now crossed over the Jordan River, and they're moving now, and we have to remember, they're moving into enemy territory. This land has been promised to them, but it's inhabited by people, by other peoples and nations, and these people just aren't going to willingly give up their land, okay? And so we kind of lose sight of that. It's not just open country here. There's other people there. And so they've now crossed over into what's promised to them, but is still, I would consider, enemy territory. So here's what we read in Joshua chapter 5, verse 1. Now when all the Amorite kings west of the Jordan and all the Canaanite kings along the coast heard how the Lord dried up the Jordan before the Israelites until they had crossed over, their hearts melted in fear, and they no longer had the courage to face the Israelites. That in and of itself is amazing. Okay, there's a miracle happening right here. These people are just running away. They're leaving their own land because of what God is doing through the Israelite people, these demonstrations. So I'm no military strategist, but if I'm preparing a battle plan and the enemy is already running away, what logically do you think you should do? I think you'd keep chasing them. Like, keep them moving. Once you got them heading in the wrong direction, you'd keep them moving that way. But God doesn't work the same way that I work and that we work. Here's God's battle plan. So the enemy's already fleeing, and here's what God tells Joshua and the Israelites to do. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites again." So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the Israelites at Gibeath Haraloth. If you understand circumcision, that puts you at a very great military disadvantage. I don't know what the strategy is here, but there's a reason for it. And like I said, this in and of itself is a miracle. God created space in the order of these events for this to happen. Had the Amorite kings and the Canaanite kings not fled because of what they saw God doing, there would not have been time enough for the Israelites to successfully circumcise all their males and be ready to fight again. We know that circumcision is not a good military strategy because we've seen it before in the past in Genesis. If you go back to Genesis chapter 34, I'm not going to read the story. You can look at it yourself. But essentially, this thing of circumcision was used kind of as a trick and to the advantage of two of Jacob's sons in avenging something that had happened to Jacob's daughter. And what we read in Genesis chapter 34 and verse 25 is this: on the third day, when they were sore, speaking of this city that had just circumcised all their men, when they were sore, two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, which is Jacob's daughter, took their swords and came against the city while it felt secure and killed all the males. Here, all the males of this city are in a very vulnerable position, still healing from this process, and Jacob and Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, enact this revenge and kill all the males in the city because they're vulnerable. So here Israel is, and I couldn't find a good number, but by some counts it could be upwards of hundreds of thousands of men that were circumcised at this time. And this isn't modern medicine. Like, I can't imagine a flint knife. Like, anyway, we won't go into details. You can talk about that at the lunch table. This is real life. I don't know. If you let your imagination, like, actually wander to the fact of this being real, this really happened, it's, okay. So, they're vulnerable, to say the least. But God has created this space for him to do this. And why is he doing this? There's a purpose for it. Here's why. Now this is why he did so. All of those who came out of Egypt, all of the men of military age, died in the wilderness on the way after leaving Egypt. And all the people that came out had been circumcised, but all the people born in the wilderness during the journey from Egypt had not. The Israelites had moved about in the wilderness 40 years until all the men who were of military age when they left Egypt had died, since they had not obeyed the Lord. For the Lord had sworn to them that they would not see the land he had solemnly promised their ancestors to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So he raised up their sons in their place, and these were the ones Joshua circumcised. They were still uncircumcised because they had not been circumcised on the way, and after the whole nation had been circumcised, they remained where they were in camp until they were healed. And then, and this is the key part, why did God do this? Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." So the place had been called Gilgal to this day. Gilgal meaning essentially rolled away. Why did God do this? He removed that day the reproach of Egypt from the Israelites. Essentially, this is the day that the Israelites were truly free from Egypt. All that shame and baggage of being enslaved and whatever comes with that, of being minimalized people, all that's gone on this day. And he's restoring to his people this covenant that he made with them back in Genesis chapter 17. Genesis 17, verse 7 through 13. "And I will establish my covenant between me and you." This is God speaking to Abraham. "Between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and your offspring after you the land you're sojourning in, all of the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. And God said to Abraham, As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised, and shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigners who is not of your offspring. Both he who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant." This is the covenant God made with his people, and this was the demonstration of that covenant, that he would be their God and they would be his people. And this is the day. I mean, they've been wandering in the wilderness for years, essentially free from Israel, or from Egypt. But in my mind, what God is saying here is this is the day you're free. You're finally free from Egypt, from all that baggage, everything that you've carried with you, any type of identity that you brought with you from that place. I'm removing it all in this place. And we're back to where we were. I'm your God, and you're my people. And so the question I would ask here is this. I'd make this statement first: of circumcision is circumcision of the heart. Essentially what Jesus says in the New Testament to the Pharisees. It's not necessarily about this outward performance, but it's circumcision of the heart. Is there something that needs to be cut off before I can step into and enjoy the promised land of God? Today I've rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. They couldn't enter into the promised land and enjoy it and be fulfilled in it, carrying with them that Egypt baggage yet. And so God cuts that off and removes that from them. Is there something that needs to be cut off before I can step into and enjoy the promised land of God? And then the final element of this is the Passover. Picking up on verse 10. On the evening of the 14th day of the month, while camped at Gilgal on the plains of Jericho, the Israelites celebrated the Passover. The day after the Passover, that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened bread and roasted grain. The manna stopped the day after they ate this food and from the land, and there was no longer any manna for the Israelites, but that year they ate the produce of Canaan. There's a couple things to note here. That first of all, participation in Passover was prohibited by those who were uncircumcised. So now this act has been completed, and they can partake, they can celebrate this event. Something they hadn't done in their wandering. It's been 40 years since they celebrated the Passover. And the Passover itself calls them to do what? It calls them to remember. Remember what God did that night in Egypt when he led you out. That celebration itself is an act of remembering. And so this covenant has been restored. In some ways we can say order has been restored. The Passover is being practiced now when it should be, in the way that it should be. The people have been re-covenanted with God. The reproach of Egypt has been removed. All things have been seemingly made right in this moment. And during that celebration, they eat the fruits of the promised land. They eat of the roasted grain and the produce of this land God has promised to them. And after that, the man is gone. And so God's still, he's still providing for them. And sometimes God shows up and provides miraculously, as he did for them with the manna. For 40 years in the wilderness, he provided the manna and the quail on a daily basis for them. That was a miracle. They didn't do anything to get that. God just put it there. But there's a shift now here. It's not that God's not providing for them anymore, but he's brought them into this land, and now there is something that the Israelites are going to have to do on their own. Take possession of the land. They're going to have to work the ground. I don't know this for sure, but it seems logical to me that at this point, at least in that first year, they're going to be eating and enjoying the produce and the fruit of that land that they didn't work for. It's already there as they're taking it over. But in the years to come, if they want to enjoy the promised land and the fruit of it, they're going to have to work it. God's not doing that miracle in that way for them anymore. But he's still providing. He provided the land. And so in this space, I don't know if you call this a question or a statement. Encourage us to consider this. Maybe that thing that you've been waiting on God for is within your reach. You just need to do your part. That is to say, the fruit of the promised land is right there before us. And in this case, we need to pray for discernment to see if this is the case, if this in fact is the case, and for wisdom to see what our part is. See, the Israelites are now in the promised land, but if they chose to do nothing there, the land would have done nothing for them. They had a part to play now, something they needed to do. And so the challenge here in this space that I present for us is maybe that promised land, maybe that thing that seems out of reach is not so far out of reach. I just need to do something. I need to work a little bit or move a little bit. And to know for sure, we need to discern. And that's where we ask God to see if this in fact is the case and what part do I have to play. So we have these three parts. We have the remembering, we have the significance of this circumcision, this removal of the reproach, and we have the partaking of this Passover, which brings us to this is the summary of the three questions that are all number one. The three questions that I've asked us to consider. And I would challenge us to evaluate ourselves in this way, that what area of these, if we take these three, is God putting the most pressure on you? Where do you feel the greatest tension as you listen to God? Because there might be tension in all three of these areas, but which one is the greatest? And that's the one that we want to focus on, or I challenge us to focus on. Is it that we need to be remembering rightly? Where have we set up these stones? What are the stones that we go to, that we remember? Or is it the ones that cause us to think of the mighty hand of God at work in our life and to bring us to this fear of Him? Is there something that needs to be cut off before we can truly enter into the promised land? And or is there something that we need to do? Is God telling us, calling us to move a little bit, to work a little bit? And that thing is it's just right there. We just need to go get it. So, encourage you to let God speak to you in these areas. And I just take this command of Joshua to be strong and courageous as a kind of parting words. To let the fear of God rule in your hearts, and to let what he's done in the past, that external, embolden us to move and to do what he's calling and challenging us to do, those hard things that he might be encouraging us to do. Let's pray. God, we're grateful for your presence with us, for your Spirit that lives inside of us, that gives us the strength to do what we can't do on our own. May the fear of God rule in our hearts, God, as we listen to you, as we discern what it is you're calling us to do. Thank you for the ways that you've shown up in the past, as we recall those stones, those monuments, those places where your hand was mighty in my life. God, convict us of those areas that need to be cut off. Purify us. Make us right again. Bring us back into right relationship with you. Yeah, give us wisdom and discernment to know how it is you're calling us to move. To grab hold of those promises that you have laid before us. Make us a humble and discerning and wise people. Pray in Jesus' name. Amen.